You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your seemingly awake host, Abraham.
And I am your unfairly aware host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about all the things that happen in psychology, and one of the things that we talk about, and we have talked about in the past, is consciousness. And actually, if you're joining us for the first time, we're going to rerun a previous episode that we did in discussing the case for and against consciousness. What is it? Does it exist? Is a question you might not have thought that we would be asking, but we did, because the answer may surprise you.
This is something that happened before I showed up. This is a why we do what we do before my time.
Why we did what we did.
Yeah, this is why we did what we did, not why we currently do what we currently do. I'm excited to revisit this, though, because I think that when I had been following the show as a fan, I did enjoy this episode a lot. So I'm glad that we get to revisit it a little bit with more current information.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so as I said, if you're joining us for the first time for these rerun nostalgia episodes is what we've been calling them, we are going to do a little bit of an intro here, and then after the episode, we'll do some updates on things that have happened since this episode dropped. So you'll get to hear the original content plus new updated sort of research and information and takeaways, if anything has changed for us, what has sort of happened in the world of research. Now, something we're doing now that we did not do when this episode was first published is we like to recognize on the date that our episodes publish what holidays also fall on those dates. And today is 4/26, which means it is Alien Day. And this is Alien from the franchise Alien by Ridley Scott, originally directed by Ridley Scott. And the 4/26 apparently comes from the planet that the xenomorph is discovered on, called LV-426.
Yes, the scariest movie franchise.
Yeah.
Hands down. I had nightmares about aliens for years.
Understandable.
Specifically after watching Aliens, not Alien.
Yeah.
But very scary. Yeah. Horrific creatures. It's also Pretzel Day.
Heck yeah.
So make sure get in line and don't let Michael Scott skip you.
No explanation needed. It is Pretzel Day. It is also Hug an Australian Day. So go find an Australian friend. Obviously get consent first, but if they're willing to hug, give them a hug.
Yeah, I support that.
All of Australia, hug yourself.
Yeah. Everybody in Australia, hug yourself. And it's also International Guide Dog Day, which I think is very wholesome.
Yeah. Appreciate our guide dogs. We've talked about dogs and guide dogs a little bit on this show.
Yeah, we love dogs.
Okay, so this nostalgia episode, it was our 28th episode, if you can believe it. We're now at episode 311.
And amber is the color of our energy.
That's right. If you were to count this episode among our episodes, this is 311. But the consciousness episode that we originally published was our 28th episode, published on November 22nd, 2017, back when I was hosting with Ryan. So you'll hear his voice instead of Shane's.
So back then, they introduced what to some people will sound like the radical idea that maybe consciousness doesn't exist. They lay out some arguments for consciousness and then arguments against it, and then they summarize their own thoughts about it. Overall, the episode seemed to go pretty well. But we'd like to revisit it because it is old.
It has been a while, and there's been a lot of talk about consciousness since then. Somehow, our original episode didn't put an end to this debate, and the question of consciousness has continued to vex many researchers. So, worth revisiting.
And so what we're going to do is we're going to re-air this, and we're going to share some discussions points about this and kind of talk about what's been the most updated discussions around consciousness and what we know about it today and what new information we've gained, because we know that research continues beyond our episodes, which is, again, we should be like the definitive thing, but apparently we are not.
Somehow we did not make it to canon status about this topic. You need the Why We Do What We Do seal of approval to continue to talk about something. I've decided.
We're like an alternative universe. Like, we're not the sacred timeline, which is bogus.
Man.
One day.
I was hoping I was on the sacred timeline. Oh, well. Whatever. It is what it is, I guess. All right. Well, without further ado, please enjoy this past nostalgic episode look at the case for and against consciousness. Hello, this is your host, Abraham.
And your co-host, Ryan O.
This is Why We Do What We Do.
Woo!
All right, so let's go ahead and just dive right into this because we have a lot to unpack here. And so let's first start by just giving what's the purpose of this episode or this discussion today.
And the first thing that we're going to try and do is define consciousness. But that's actually kind of our secondary goal of what we're doing today. Okay. The primary goal is we're going to discuss the fact that there are kind of two sides to this argument about whether or not consciousness is even really a thing.
Yeah.
The people who argue that it is, there are people who argue that it's not. And we're just going to explore those two options, and then we'll sort of wrap it all up at the end.
Yeah.
In a nice little package with a bow. It'll be great. Now, before we start, though, it's important to know that there is a distinction between a couple of concepts. You might hear consciousness and think of conscience.
Ooh. All right, Abraham, let's start with just a quick what's conscious? Give me a definition of some sort, you know?
Yeah, and well, there's a couple. If you look at one of the earliest definitions of psychology at all, it used to be, and I believe this was the 1800s maybe, or actually, no, it was earlier than that because Locke described consciousness in, I believe, the 17th century. But it was that psychology was the description and explanation of states of consciousness. So it implied that this entire field that we now belong to was simply studying consciousness. That was all that we were doing.
Can you define that one more time?
Yeah, so it was the description and explanation of states of consciousness. That was what psychology was.
Okay.
And then if you go back, all the way back to our episode 2, we talked about the definition of psychology and going back to the roots in Greek of psyche and ology, meaning the study of the spirit. So that has sort of a similar feel to it of this idea of studying like the essence of life or this consciousness sort of thing.
So with conscience, we're talking about this like inner feeling or voice, right?
Yeah.
Typically. And it's like this guide to rightness or wrongness.
Yeah, so I tend to just sort of succinctly describe them as that consciousness has to do with your awareness and your sense of being, and conscience has to do with your morality.
Okay, yes, I like that.
That's kind of the easiest short version of it.
Yeah.
If you look at any regular dictionary, you're going to get some kind of definition of consciousness that's something like the state or quality of awareness, okay? And if you look in a psychology textbook, which I did, you're going to see a definition that says something like awareness of ourselves and our environment. Now, so both of these entail this idea of awareness. The one that I grabbed was from Meyer and DeWall in 2015. He cites Poller and Suzuki in 2014. So these are pretty up to date, pretty contemporary versions of this definition that exists out there. And as we will discuss later, the nature of consciousness has been the subject of books and textbooks and discussions and arguments for centuries at this point. You know, what is it? How do we measure it? What does it entail? What are the characteristics of it? All that sort of stuff. And even today, this still remains a pretty common topic. And so due to this really elusive nature of this subject, that how difficult it is to understand and measure and do good research on it, it's kind of spun this counter group who are looking at this problem and saying, like, this has been such a problem for so long that maybe you guys are chasing something that's not really there.
Yeah, which has always been a very interesting part of psychology, right?
Yeah.
Like, are we chasing things that are really out there?
Yeah.
Because many argue
absolutely.
that we haven't really developed much at all since the early days, 2,500 years ago.
There's a lot of that, actually, that goes on. Man, it's fun to bring those up. Actually, I'm just thinking about all the other episodes we're going to be talking about some more of these things. I don't even want to list them right now. I'm just so excited.
So we got consciousness, but we have subconscious and unconscious things that can happen as well too. So do we want to part those?
And this one, we're going to be talking about unconsciousness and not necessarily subconscious. And where subconscious refers to the part of consciousness that you're not aware of, I guess.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the episode that we did when we're talking about subliminal messages, and that's just below the threshold of detection, that sort of thing. This is a little bit more in line with this unconscious mind, this part of your brain that is processing experiences, but where you're not necessarily aware of those experiences.
Yeah.
Cool.
Very cool.
Are we clear on that distinction?
Yeah.
I hope so. It's kind of fuzzy because it is difficult where they're different, but they are referred to in different ways in the psychological community.
So just to reiterate, for today, we're going to present the arguments that are for or against the concept of consciousness alone.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start with going into the case for consciousness. Who is in favor of this idea? Well, most people, turns out. The majority of people do support this idea that there is consciousness, but they don't necessarily agree on what it is, but we'll get into that. And one of the very foremost people you're going to find, if you look up consciousness, if you Google it at all, you're going to end up with a man named Daniel Dennett.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with that name.
Yeah, Daniel Dennett. I remember him for a TED Talk about the illusion of consciousness. I remember all the details. I didn't refresh on that. But books, author, he's kind of everywhere. I believe he even influenced some folks like Richard Dawkins, but I'm not positive to what extent.
Well, he's also pretty active in the skeptical community, and so I think in as far as Richard Dawkins is a part of that community, they probably have a lot of common ground on this, and I know Richard Dawkins has spoken quite a bit about consciousness as well, and we'll get to him a little bit later. But yeah, he's written a lot of books, articles. I think he has a blog, all this sort of stuff. I'm quoting him here, although I think I may have muddled the quote a little bit. He says, quote, "Consciousness is wonderful, but not magic. It's a bunch of tricks of the brain." And so he's basically saying that consciousness is not this thing that exists in a dual universe. It's not something that exists outside of our body. It is a part of our brain. It is a part of our body, and it's what our brain sort of does. Okay, that seems to be where he really lands on this. And there's some other people who argue in favor of this idea of what Daniel Dennett calls a Cartesian theater. And this is sort of a derisive term. He used this to criticize this notion of consciousness where we have sort of like a little inner me sitting on a couch watching a video of what outer me is doing and seeing. And so that inner me is the one sort of that's pulling the strings on the brain and getting it to do things. And of course, this goes on of like, well, how does he know what to do? He must have an inner me inside of him as well. And there's just, on and on and on. And he sort of says, this doesn't work. It isn't useful. He doesn't really fall. But some people who are in favor of consciousness like that model, although they don't call it the Cartesian theater, but that's what he gives that name to it. So anyway, let's go into some of Daniel Dennett's arguments. He says that one of the reasons that consciousness, or what it is and how we know it's there, is that we are capable of seeing patterns where they don't necessarily exist.
All right. So you showed me this illusion beforehand, and I guess we'll go into the backstory. You're just like, Google this thing where there's a bunch of circles when the negative space in the image, like, apparently forms this box.
Yeah, it looks like a cube where you
Yes.
just see the edges of the cube, and that's implied by the negative space of the black circles. But all that's present is on the paper, in this image, are black circles with some negative space missing.
Yeah.
Okay. And so this seems to suggest that our brain or our mind is filling in the gaps and perceiving that there is a cube there, even though the vast majority of the lines that would indicate or that would be the image of a cube aren't even there. We're only seeing the cube in the negative space of those circles, and they don't even make up the majority of the lines of the cube. So this idea that our mind can sort of fill in those blank spaces seems to suggest that we have this stream of consciousness that allows us to interpret these bigger picture sort of things. And that it's a trick that our brain uses to understand the world around us.
And that would make sense, I guess, from his perspective of, he's, like you said, tying it back to these tricks of the brain.
Right, yeah.
Now, also from our other episodes, like, it could be just a product of evolution, reinforcement, learning, right? Like anything else like that, right?
Jumping the gun.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe I'm jumping the gun.
So essentially, the fact that we can do this pattern recognition of things entails that is what is special about consciousness, is the fact that we can infer and interpret and do these sorts of things where those things don't necessarily exist, but we can sort of behave as if they do. We can act like they're there. All right. And then have you heard of this blind sight effect?
Blind sight, yes. So the idea here that some alteration happens to where you report, so that could be like some event or often traumatic events, right?
Yeah, brain injury, I think, for the most part.
Yeah. And as a result, you report that you cannot interact or see these sort of things, but you can still behave with respect to them.
Yeah, so that was what I found, was that there was a specific story of a woman who had some brain damage to, I can't remember which part of her brain, maybe the occipital lobe, and she was unable to tell the difference between objects that she was seeing. I mean, basically anything. She couldn't describe anything that she was seeing. But what was interesting is she could correctly orient like a letter to fit inside a slot, where the slot was only wide enough for the letter to go in vertically, but she didn't even try to put it in horizontally. She just put it in, and presumably without feeling it first to make sure she had the right orientation. And walking down the hallway, they specifically placed these obstacles, and she would just walk around them. Although she couldn't necessarily say that they were there or what they were, she would still be able to orient to them. And it's important to say in here, when I say that she couldn't tell the difference between these things, what we mean is that she couldn't verbally label those objects.
Yeah.
Okay. And so even though she could act that they were there, she couldn't describe them verbally, which, I mean, that's important to know. And it's important to come back. We'll come back to this idea later about what that means and how to sort of interpret that, because it might be a little bit different talking about how we talk about things versus how we act toward things.
Yeah. So to get back to our definition of awareness of ourselves and our environment, like, she's showing that in this situation, right? Yeah. But she just can't talk about it.
Yeah, awareness in one sense, but maybe not in the sense that she maybe knows or can talk about it very clearly. So it's like maybe there's like a gray area of awareness.
Yeah, okay.
And so another one is this idea called change blindness. This is the fact that when something changes right in front of you, then you can notice that change. But if you interrupt the flow of what you're seeing, and then when that change takes place, so to give you an example, if you have a picture, and in that picture you have a whole bunch of people, and then in part of the picture, the group of people goes missing. So I'm going to show you the first picture that has everyone there. Then there's going to be a white screen, and then I'm going to show you the new picture, which is exactly the same, except 3 of those people are missing. How long would it take you to figure out that those people were missing? You'd probably have to scan the whole thing a whole bunch of times. And if I just kept flashing it over and over, it would take a while for you to go through and figure out everything. This is just one of these sort of visual perception tests that they do, looking for whether or not you can detect where things are. And so the idea here is that if you interrupt the stream of consciousness, then you have a difficult time identifying where that change is. But if the change just takes place, even if you aren't even oriented to that part of the picture, you'll notice the change. But it's when that stream of consciousness is interrupted with that white screen, it's difficult for you to find where the change is.
I don't know if we need to call it consciousness necessarily when we see this other change in the environment happening right out there.
It's interesting that they sort of went this route, I think, in making that the evidence to sort of look at and evaluate consciousness.
Yeah.
I also have a hard time sort of understanding why was that the choice
Yeah.
to go after, you know?
White consciousness versus any other thing that might be occurring there.
Right.
Such as everything that's happening perception-wise.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think the people who do this, mostly in perception research, they're very interested in this by looking at what's happening in your eye.
Yeah.
How is this related to how the neurons are connected to these different parts of your brain and that sort of thing. And I think they really are just like, what's going on here at this physiological level is fine, that's interesting. And none of them go with this going, oh, your consciousness, at least not that I've heard. There is cognitive neuroscience and they take a slightly different approach. All right. Another reason that people sort of argue in favor of this idea that we have consciousness is that going back to this idea that consciousness is our awareness, well, we know that our state of awareness can be altered by a lot of different things. So, for example, one I can think of is sleep.
Yes.
When someone is sleeping versus being awake, they're very different in how they're interacting with the world around them. It seems pretty clear that there is a different kind of consciousness, one where basically they're not conscious, they're unconscious, which is to say they're not aware of themselves or their environment, and then one where they are.
Yeah. Similar things, like I've had some outdoor sports accidents in the past that have led to pain medications and such. And those can also seem to alter your awareness. Now, like, same thing, the degree to which it alters it, like I haven't felt necessarily unconscious per se, but it definitely alters my awareness of myself.
But in the general argument of whether or not we have consciousness, this idea that, like drugs, any kind of drugs, even, the illegal drugs or pharmaceuticals, if those can alter how we are aware of our world and ourselves, that is an argument that is used in favor of this idea that we have consciousness. And then the third one is when people meditate. People go into these meditative states, and that also changes how aware they are of themselves and their environment, presumably very aware of themselves, but maybe less so of their environment. And so that's just, a deviation in these different types of awareness that we have, these different types of consciousness. And so this seems to suggest that our awareness is central to how we experience the world. And this is one that most people can respond to as having had a personal connection to with respect to that description of how their awareness is sort of altered and how it can change. Everybody has to sleep. If you live longer than 1 day, maybe 2 days, like you're eventually going to be asleep. And so everyone knows what it's like to go in and out of this consciousness, at least in the context of sleep. And then a lot of other people have experiences using alcohol and drugs and meditation and that sort of thing, where they can also speak to what their level of consciousness and how it's different. And so because people can really relate to this one's very compelling. It's very personal to be able to say, I've had that experience. I know what it's like. I agree with you. Like, that must be it. We've got it.
Yeah.
Right?
The evidence shows that it has to be real.
Yeah. I've got my own evidence.
Yeah.
I went to sleep last night. I'm awake right now. Those are two different things.
Yeah. We had talked about that in a past episode. I think in the first one, we were talking about psychology and like what it could be and the fact that everybody experiences behavior, whatever it is, can cause some problems into making you feel as if you're an expert.
Yes.
And to what extent are you an expert? Just because you experienced something.
Right. Yeah, actually, so Daniel Dennett has a whole, I think it was in his TED Talk, he specifically goes over this idea of, everyone thinks they're an expert in consciousness, and other psychologists have said everyone thinks they're an expert in psychology because we're dealing with subject matter that people experience throughout their lives all day long, that it kind of makes sense. You get this issue of people who really feel like, you're telling me things I already know. I already know all this stuff about myself. You don't have to tell me psychology's worthless. We already know everything. I don't want to discredit the fact that people have these personal experiences. They do, and they're important. And studying how those things work is a little bit different in like understanding the process and everything.
Yeah.
So, but you're absolutely right that people really connect to this idea of consciousness and therefore do find themselves to be experiences. And I don't want to blanket statement this the way that Daniel Dennett does. There are probably a lot of people who are quite skeptical of this. Well, we know that there are. We're going to talk about them.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who don't necessarily consider them experts. And there's probably a lot of people, the majority of them, who just never even considered it and don't care.
Yeah.
If that's you, if that describes you and you're listening in right now, thanks for listening.
Yeah.
I hope you still enjoy the episode anyway.
All right. So we have this idea of anterograde amnesia.
Right.
So the idea is that you can't form new memories, right?
Right.
But you're still learning things.
Well, that's what's interesting about it. A lot of people didn't think that you could still learn things, and it kind of makes sense. So with there's anterograde and retrograde amnesia, which we didn't talk about in our memory episode, but that refers to, with retrograde, is you lose your past memories, and anterograde refers to the inability to form new memories.
And that's from the time of the event, right? Whatever
Yes.
happened. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Like the movie Memento.
So it's not like a continually moving thing, right? It's like there's some sort of event that happens. And
Right.
that's where the retro or antero come from.
Yeah, so to give an example, they had one gentleman in, I believe, the 50s who they surgically removed part of his hippocampus, or maybe the entire thing. It was a significant chunk of his hippocampus, which is where memory processing typically takes place in the brain. And thereafter, after that surgery, he could only like describe things in about a 2 to 3 minute window. And then after that period of time, it was like he was just starting over. And it was just every 2 to 3 minutes, where am I? What's going on? It feels like I've died and just sort of woken up because it's been an indefinite period of time since the last time I remember something, which was prior to a surgery.
Yeah.
And up until that point, you know, every day is immediately following a surgery, even years and years and years later. And so it's like, as things change, it becomes more and more of a surprise to him.
Yeah.
But what was really interesting is that the researchers who were able to work with this individual, they found that they could teach him things and he would learn them, which spoke to the fact that although the hippocampus is central to dealing with memory processing, memory does take place in a lot of ways in the brain in that it's not necessarily stored or processed in only one way and in only one place. It involves a lot of different elements of the brain and how it works, as we said in our memory episode, I believe.
Yep.
And what was really interesting about his case was that they could teach him something and he wouldn't necessarily be able to say that he learned it or who taught it to him or when he learned it, but he would know it. And they were teaching him facts about things, people that had become famous or had died after his surgery, about major events that had taken place. He'd be able to remember them. He would even be able to supplant specific details about them, but he wouldn't be able to tell you the person he was working with at the time. And he wouldn't be able to tell you what day it was. And even other skills that were not necessarily verbal, where they would teach him, oh, and this is actually really cool. They did this with Alzheimer's patients as well, is they would teach them these skills and they would say, hey, do you know how to do this? And they'd say, no, I've never learned how to do that. And then they'd be able to perform whatever it was afterward.
Yeah. Super interesting.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So, you know, when you're like walking and you stub your toe and it's just the most infuriating thing and it just hurts so bad in the moment? That is ads. Okay, we're back.
So this idea here suggests that there's this unconscious process, right? That's like guiding this new learning that's occurring and like this performance.
I guess it suggests that there's an unconscious process that guides learning and subsequent performance that's part of the reciprocal sort of conscious process. And so even though people who will not be necessarily aware, they can still do things that they're not aware of. And if there is a reciprocal side of unconscious, that means that there also must be a side of conscious that sort of correspond to that. I think that's sort of how that argument goes.
All right.
Okay.
So you said you had two more.
Yeah. So, and actually, I kind of just sort of teased the other one, which was that unconsciousness is a reciprocal process to consciousness. So I guess in this one, the argument sort of goes that if we have consciousness and we have unconsciousness, like we know that there's unconsciousness, then that really seems to suggest there has to be something that is the opposite of that. Like we can look at someone who's sleeping, someone who's been knocked out, or someone who otherwise has had their consciousness altered. And we can point to that and say that, like, look, there's unconsciousness. What is not that thing has to be something else. And what that thing is consciousness. And some examples that I've seen quite a bit are, you know, we're not aware of what it feels like or the process of our stomachs digesting food and our intestines processing food and all of that. If just sitting here, if I were to say, what do your pants feel like on your skin? you really didn't notice until I said something, and then you might be paying attention to it. But where our clothing is touching us, there's air flowing around us, and there's all of these experiences that we're having, and we don't really identify any of them unless it sort of is brought to your attention. And so even though those processes are there and they're engaged, they're not necessarily conscious in this idea. And so again, this idea that there's this conscious, unconscious. And there are also times when people will react to things before they've even realized, quote unquote, that they have to react to something. And that this sort of indicates, okay, so something was going on unconsciously, so we were able to react to things consciously. How were we able to do that if we weren't having some unconscious process going on? And another one is that there are times that people, they'll sort of be able to guess at something, and it's not even really an educated guess. They'll just sort of make a guess, and they'll arrive at the correct conclusion and really not have any idea how they could have possibly guessed that. And it's like they might have had some of the information that they needed, but not necessarily have the answer right on hand. And so they just sort of venture a guess and they get it correct. Then it's sort of, they're thinking, oh, my unconscious was what guided me in this.
Could have been anything else that also happened around that time period.
It could be virtually anything.
Yeah.
And the last one, and this is kind of related to what I was saying already, is just that our bodies experience an enormous amount of stimulation and things that happen to it throughout the day for which we seemingly have no awareness. Like, I don't think we wake up and go through the day, and every time one of our hair follicles grows a little longer, we think about it, and every time we blink, we are able to go, oh, I just blinked.
Yeah.
This stuff happens kind of automatically, and so this is sort of this level of unconscious of things that we're not necessarily aware of, but of things that are always sort of going on and being processed, and we can objectively look at them and say, again, if there's an unconscious, then what is the things that we are aware of, that we are deliberately doing? And so most people tend to agree on this idea of consciousness having intentionality to it.
Yeah.
So it's the things that we do because they have a purpose and we're sort of oriented to some goal or something like that.
Seems to just add a lot of unnecessary things.
It almost feels like a net of just sort of like, what are all the things that we can catch in here that we're going to fit with this definition we're trying to find evidence for?
Yeah.
But I want to end on that last one real quick, is this idea that we constantly have this conscious and unconscious going on is called the two-track mind, okay? And so one thing, although most people don't necessarily agree with Freud anymore, and I know there are some people who really, really do agree with a lot of Freud, most people out there, most psychologists aren't really practicing psychoanalysis anymore. The argument that this idea of this dual-track mind, some people are saying, well, maybe Freud didn't get a lot of things right, but he definitely got this fact that so much of what we experience is unconscious. We got that correct. Or he got that correct. And so this is kind of similar to what I was saying earlier about this idea that sometimes we'll learn some skill or some piece of information, and then another time we'll learn a different skill or another piece of information. And then at some critical moment, we're able to sort of intuitively combine those two things. And it could be multiple, it doesn't have to be two, it could be a dozen things.
Yeah.
We're able to combine them to react to something without having really explicitly learned how to combine them or knowing that we combine them at all. You might be able to combine these things, these skills that you have, this knowledge that you have to solve a problem in the moment, but not even know how you did it. And that was sort of related to the one I said before.
Which, yeah, that's still like we're always in this novel, new environment necessarily, like going throughout this point in time, which new things are combining always.
Yeah.
So
that is
it still seems to be kind of adding more than we need to, just because that's always happening already. Why do we need to add in that it's our consciousness that allows us to do that?
Well, you're basically chomping at the bit, so let's go ahead and just jump into the case against consciousness.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm for or against it right now.
Okay.
Figuring it out. I think I know where I sit, but...
All right, well, we'll get through this last section, and then we can sort of declare where we are, and then we'll pull our listeners to jump in and say what they think about this whole argument. So again, and before we go into any of this, consciousness and conscience are different things. I had, some papers from students who, when I wrote on this, I didn't think to make that distinction, didn't realize that was going to be a confusion, even though they sound almost identical. It just didn't occur to me. And a lot of people are saying, of course we have morality. Everyone's got, a conscience. That's how we make good decisions in life.
Yeah.
I'm like, that is totally not what I meant, but that's okay. Didn't make that clear. Anyway, let's go ahead and go into these. The case against consciousness. One of the widest criticisms against this idea of consciousness is that it is 100% subjective.
Yeah, so we've talked about a lot of this. Like everyone thinks, feels, perceives from this like different perspective with a different learning history, right?
Yeah.
And so at what point can we really draw the lines on like, I guess, like being able to objectively measure these sort of things and understand these things.
Yeah, the experience that everyone has is unique to each person. And so we can't even know what it feels like or looks like to another person, even when we're experiencing the same event. That doesn't mean that the person next to you is experiencing that event in the same way that you are. And even if we could somehow peek into that biology, peel back the layers and get out our best machinery, and even if we could download their thoughts, our interpretation of that experience would still be colored by our own history and our own understanding, and our interpretation of that experience that'd be different from the one that they would get out of that.
Yeah.
So it's not just the experience itself. It is also like what you've learned up to that point.
This is why it's so hard to get to know another person on any sort of personal or intimate level. It's why it's so hard to not get into arguments on forums or social media platforms. Like, there's just so much uniqueness.
Right.
And the fact that you bring that in, even when it does appear to be objective, it's still there.
We see the world through our lens, and it's very difficult to put on another person's, glasses. Matter of fact, it's virtually impossible to be able to totally experience the world from someone else's perspective. I mean, you can get some good ideas about it, and there are things that you can do to change your experience so that it'll be similar to someone else's, but it'll always be a little bit different.
Yeah.
If not a lot different.
Now, what about this idea that, like, well, if we look at it and measure it, like, the average will still tell us something. Like, we can still glean some sort of information from there.
Yeah, and even when you do that, and going back to this idea of perception tests and how long it takes people when you interrupt their flow of consciousness to identify changes in pictures, that doesn't necessarily tell you anything about consciousness. That will tell you about how well they do at identifying change when it's interrupted by things. So that might tell you something about how their vision is processed. Those are indirect ways of trying to get at this question, and they're very average. So again, you get sort of, what do people tend to do? Okay, that's great. Now, how do I know what they're experiencing in terms of their consciousness? Is that their consciousness? What role does their consciousness have? These are questions that kind of test isn't going to answer. It sort of tells you how well people do on average on these simple tests, but these aren't consciousness tests. They're just perception and performance tests. And so the level of subjectivity in this understanding might suggest that consciousness isn't a thing at all. We all have this personal subjective experience, and that is not a unique event. It's just a part of being alive. It's the nature of being alive and being a person in this case, but I think even being an animal, you could argue that they have consciousness, but I don't know if you need to, because again, we're talking about, is this a thing that even needs to exist?
Okay, cool. That's the first one.
Yeah. Second one. So when I asked you before we even started, what might be an argument for or against consciousness, and we were talking about against, one of the very first things you said was the definition.
Yes, so there is no consistent definition anywhere that's agreed upon.
Yeah.
Not even close.
No.
Like,
it's kind of all over
close.
the place.
Yeah.
Sometimes consciousness refers only to being awake versus being asleep. Sometimes that's included with other things. Sometimes it's agency versus being inanimate. So agency meaning that it has its own will, its own goals and drive to do something, and inanimate being just something that has no life, like a rock or a cup.
Sometimes, like, we've highlighted this a lot, and I've kind of responded to this, like, is it perception based or is it some sort of interpretational thing?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so there's all these different definitions. Even in the top players in the philosophy of consciousness, they disagree on what the characteristics are and what the definition should be. And they've been arguing about it for decades now. And part of this, we sort of mentioned at the beginning, is this idea of having awareness, and the definition brings a whole host of problems.
Yes.
Right? Dennett specifically rejects the awareness as a part of that definition, although a lot of people don't. We'll get back to him. But what does it mean to be aware?
Well, that's the tricky part.
If I were to say, like, are you aware what color your computer is? Could you tell me?
Yeah, it's black.
All right. So then
Silver.
Do I know that you're aware of it?
Well, I mean, yes, we would assume that.
I guess
And
so. I mean, you labeled it.
Right? Yeah.
Are you aware of the weather outside right now?
Ish. Like, I can't tell you exactly, but yeah.
Okay. So all of these things that you're reporting to me, these are just sort of your statements.
Mhm.
Like, that's just your language about how you label things. And so when we think about, are you aware of the mark that's on your forehead right now? You don't have one. I'm just saying that, like,
Yeah.
if someone had something on their face, are you aware there's something in your teeth? What you're really asking them is, do you know that it's there? Which is to say, could you tell me that it was there if I hadn't said anything? If you looked in a mirror, would you be surprised?
What about that old article, Awareness in the Pigeon?
Oh, there's self-awareness in the pigeon.
Self-awareness, sorry.
Yeah. And that was the one where if they put a dot on a pigeon.
Yeah, that's what made me think of it.
Yeah. First, they taught the pigeon if it pecked the dot, then they would get food.
Mhm.
And then they moved the dot around. So wherever the dot was, or they pecked it, it would get food. And then they put it on the pigeon.
Yes.
And it wasn't pecking the dot. But then they put up a mirror and the pigeon pecked the dot in the mirror. And the reason that they started doing this is because there are these like self-perception tests that they did with kids in a mirror. And if they put like a little dot on the kid's forehead, then would the kid look in the mirror, see the dot and touch it? Yeah. And then psychologists are looking at this going, look, they have a concept of self. And Skinner's like, okay, well, pigeons have a concept of self then. And so he just showed that if he taught them to peck at a dot and then put a dot on them and showed them a mirror, they would peck at the dot on their chest, where they would even have a blinder where they couldn't see it if they just looked down. They'd have to be able to look in the mirror and see it so that they could peck at it and be able to get food.
So we're saying, sorry for this side. Thanks for that.
No worries.
So when we say that we have to like verbally be able to label it, are we saying then that animals don't have a consciousness, or like where does that kind of fall? Like,
that is kind of implied by this. And I think it's important to say, okay, when we're talking about the fact that you have to be able to label it verbally, and that's what we sort of mean by aware. I like that only because that is how most people talk about awareness. Are you aware of the way your pants feel on your clothes? Like, oh, I wasn't, but now I am. Or, are you aware of X, Y, or Z, these other things where you don't necessarily know about them? And it's really, when people talk about, are you aware of these things, they really seem to be referring to whether or not someone can label it, whether they can describe it verbally. Although they oftentimes mean just, do you know about this? But then, of course, we have to get into, okay, what does know mean? It's like, are you aware? Oh, by aware, I mean, do you know? And so this goes again to, how do I know if you know? Well, you can label it. The other way is that you can act towards it as efficiently and effectively as possible. So it's like, given some level of contact with whatever that thing is, which I guess could also say, do you remember? And maybe this is getting more into like memory, which would imply that there's some history with a particular cue that is signaling this, going back to that episode on memory. But this idea of, if you know it, then you can act toward it in a particular way. But okay, so if I put something in front of you and you're able to do it right away, then if I say that you know it, does that somehow change the fact that you did it? Does that make it better in the case of consciousness? If I lay consciousness on top of that, does that explain it better that you were able to do it? Or if I say that you know it, does that explain it better that you were able to do it? Or if I just look at, okay, here are the steps it took for you to get to this part where you're able to do this puzzle or this task that I set in front of you, whatever it is. If I have those steps, then I don't know why adding know or consciousness on top of that tells me anything new about what you just did. The question I have about this is like, okay, we're going into this definition. This definition tends to use the word aware, although some people don't. But let's say that we're using the one that does say your awareness of your environment. Why is awareness special? And as you said, does it mean animals have no awareness because they can't label their environment, but we know that they know some things? So if we just go with knowing, is knowing good enough? But if then, is it important to say that they know it? And is that evidence for consciousness? Like, this just raises a whole host of questions for which I don't think that there's really an answer, because they're all sort of conceptual, right? And this idea of, if we can learn something, going back to these people who have some sort of brain damage, they have difficulty forming new memories or something else that has affected their memory or whatever. If they learn it, but they can't label it, that seems to almost speak more to some kind of deficit in their language processing, right? Or how they understand or create their language about things. Or maybe there's some other trouble with the network of connections that are needed to sort of identify things, both in terms of the cues and the neurology and everything else, and the history, the learning history. Why is consciousness an explanation?
It adds this, like, why do we need to add this other thing in there?
Yeah. And if the only evidence for consciousness is the fact that it happens at all.
Well, it sounds like we're back into circular reasoning.
Again, for the how many time?
Yeah, right? And it seems to be like, not to discredit, but like a less admirable sort of question than like, is it just, we're getting back into like our ability to name things as opposed to this illusionary kind of like subconscious, conscious, like, all these other terms, right?
Completely.
Yeah.
So that was just on the awareness part of it. Another problem with this definition is this term called reification. Have you heard that term?
Yes.
So what does that mean?
So it's simply just treating this thing as if it's real when it's not.
Yeah, the idea that something that's abstract, and then we talk about it as if it's real. And so I kind of had an analogy for that. So just starting with, first, we're just going to observe that people are doing things, and we're not going to have a name for it. We observe that we have similar experiences to these things, and then we describe that observation of people doing things, and then sometimes naming those things. We call that consciousness, okay? So the fact that we can observe that we're doing things and we can name things, we're going to call that consciousness. And so now we're off to hunt for consciousness as its own event. Even though we just came up with a name for that observation that we had that people are doing things, we now have to go hunt for that thing that we just came up with a name for, as it's on its own. It's its own thing now, and we need to go find it. And to this end, a guy named Schlinger in 2008 wrote an article called "Consciousness is Nothing But a Word." And so I'm going to quote him directly. He says, quote, "Consciousness is not a thing, a place, or a cognitive process, whatever that is. It's only a word that we use in a variety of ways." Then he goes on to list some of what those ways are and some other characteristics of consciousness. Basically, what Schlinger is arguing is that this idea of consciousness, that's just that description. It's just a word that we use to label these, like a whole host of characteristics of things, and it doesn't actually refer to anything that's sort of really out there.
I like it.
Cool. Okay.
I'm a little biased to his position in psychology and how he views it, though. I will say that.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
So until the day that we can actually just implant ads into your subconscious so that they just kind of play behind the back of your eyelids, we're just going to play these out loud into your auditory canal. So here's another ad. And we're back.
Okay. Now, another very common argument against this idea of consciousness is that a lot of times, and with understandable reason, it gets sort of reduced to the fact that it's just these neurological processes.
Yes.
Okay. Which is to say that it's not subjective experience, it's not a learned history, it's not part of your environment, it's just
your biology, nothing
just
else.
what your neurons are doing, that's it. So I'm going to quote someone specifically on this. This was actually Francis Crick in 1994, the late Francis Crick. So, quote, "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Okay. And again, so he's just saying that this idea of everything about you, it's just your biology. That's it. That's all there is to you. And I mean, you can infer from this that all there is to you is your brain and what your brain is doing.
If that's the case, then do we need anything else
No.
to study or learn from or work with?
Presumably, if you do enough research on the biology of the organism, you'd completely and totally understand all behavior all the time.
So we'd understand why architects build buildings and design things certain ways.
Yep.
We'd understand why we do everything that we do.
Everything. Every single thing that you do you could look at a brain and you could know exactly every action that person would take for the rest of their lives.
It surprised me that this is like a thing that people are kind of like into in the first place.
It is.
You
I
know?
agree.
Like why like I'm going to discredit everything else in the world as my argument as to why this thing is a thing.
Yeah. And I think to be fair, so hold on. I guess I should take a step back and say, I don't actually know if that's the position that these people would take on this necessarily, but that is sort of if you extend this argument out to the point of like, where does this break down? It doesn't go very far before you reach the level of absurdity, right?
Yeah.
That it's just sort of, nobody's going to take that position that presumably if we study a brain, we will know everything about a person. Maybe they just mean we'll study a brain and we'll understand everything about them right now, which is fine, I guess. That is what it is.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot more of asking, how did it get this way?
That could be a spinoff of the podcast. It is what it is. It is what it is. Brought to you by the Why We Do What We Do crew.
That struck me in just the right way, I gotta say. That's
Hopefully it
hilarious.
struck some listeners as well.
Yeah.
What's the next quote we need to look at?
The next one, this comes from a guy named Chalmers. He's a big researcher in this field. This quote was from 2000, I believe. And so he says, quote, "The search for neural correlates of consciousness, or what he calls NCCs, is arguably the cornerstone in the recent resurgence of the science of consciousness." And so he's sort of just stating in this case what's going on currently in sort of common psychological, neurological research. But he is accurate in saying that this idea of neural correlates is very popular at the time that this occurred. But that, again, speaks to this idea that what we're really looking for, we can't seem to define consciousness in a way that anybody can agree on. We can't seem to figure out what it is. So we're just going to try and find out where it is. And the only evidence we're going to have for it lies in the what's going on in the brain. So to quote Schlinger in response to this, he says, "Before we search for the neural correlates of consciousness, we need to know what consciousness is."
Yeah.
Which
yeah.
seems pretty important. You know, if we're going to go hunting around in the brain looking for it, we have to know what it is we're looking for. It's like, imagine I tell you, here's $1 million, go find me a snark. You might say,
but I don't know where a snark is.
yeah, he might say, great, that's awesome. What is a snark?
Yeah.
I'm going to say, no one knows, but here's $1 million in it for you if you can find one. Right. And it's sort of, everyone's spending tons and tons of money going out looking for this consciousness, and they have no idea what it is they're even looking for, hoping, I guess, that if they throw enough things against the wall, something is going to stick.
There's been a lot of that shown in various different areas too, including educational research.
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to something we've brought up many times on this podcast before, which is that the brain is part of our behavior, but behavior is not found there.
Yes.
Right? The brain is very critically important in everything that we do, but you aren't going to find the explanations of behavior just by looking at what the brain is currently doing. That's just part of it.
Yep. Yeah, it's solely not found there.
And sort of just a logical argument here, if consciousness is literally just these brain processes, then why not just refer to consciousness as those brain processes? We already have a term for that. We already have names and understandings of what those processes are and how they work. We don't need two different names that mean virtually exactly the same thing, but where one name sort of implies this metaphysical agency thing and the other one doesn't, but the other one doesn't mean the metaphysical agency. It only refers to those brain processes. Like if it's just brain processes, just call them that. That's what they are. They are neurological events that take place. And that's what's happening.
Yeah. I think that could be a hard thing because you feel like you got to kind of make your own thing, right? And kind of have your own 5 steps or...
You mean like make a name for yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
mean,
guess I could
have
see.
to.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Another argument against this.
So I kind of like this one. So Noel Smith, right? Comes from this, even in the backgrounds that you and I have, like an area that... not even a lot of behavioral folks are super in tune with this sort of area, right?
Yeah, this is not that well known.
So it's this idea that there's a difference between events and constructs, right? So is consciousness an event or a construct? We need to kind of drop that, right? All right. So a construct, he explained, is this representation of a thing, either in words, math, symbols, etc. And consciousness is certainly a construct because it has no clear event that is composed of.
Yeah, I think that he sort of says that well in terms of if this is what a construct is, just a representation, this is why consciousness is a construct, because it also is just a representation. It doesn't have a thing that we know what it is.
Yeah. Now an event would actually be a thing, right?
Yeah.
So describe an event.
Well, it doesn't even have to be tangible. An event is just anything that takes place or happens or is, right? It could be tangible, but it doesn't have to be. And to that point, so just to make the argument of, we're not saying that our subjective experience isn't real, but what we're making the case is that the experience of consciousness is a construct because things like imagining and feeling, those are events because those are things that people do. People think, people feel, people guess. There's all these things that we can do that we don't even necessarily see, but they're things that we do that are definite actions, and those would be called events. But consciousness, it doesn't have an event. I can't look at you and say, are you consciousing right now? We can't identify what they are. We don't even know when it's happening in ourselves. And so that's why he argues that it's not an event, it has to be a construct. And so if we sort of deconstruct this idea of, is this an event that's out in the world, or is this just an idea and sort of an abstract idea at that, then that will help us, I think, understand what we're talking about when we refer to this.
Cool. So you're saying consciousness has no correlation with anything either observable within ourselves or with others when we're watching them.
Basically.
Yeah. I can get behind that.
Yeah, and it's therefore an idea that's not improved by reducing it to biology or assigning a whole bunch of characteristics to it, because it doesn't even really refer to anything. It doesn't refer to any real process. It seems to be made up of processes that are real, but those processes we already have names for. We already understand what they are. So consciousness, sort of this sort of global, bigger picture name for it. I also wanted to come back to the one where we were talking about intuition, this insight where we sort of come up with on the spot the correct answer or a solution to something, or we will react without even knowing. I think that this is important to, as you said before, we actually do this a lot throughout the day, throughout our everyday lives. And these aren't like these big aha moments every single time.
No.
It's just that things change and we change, and it makes intuitive, evolutionary, logical, all the sense in the world. It makes all the sense that we can sort of generalize and extend and apply our skills immediately to situations where they're needed without having to sit and ponder and try and wrap our brains around, our minds around the nature of the knowledge beforehand. This type of event isn't really special. We actually do it a lot. And sometimes the magnitude of it is larger or the implications of it are larger, but that's not improved at all by this idea of consciousness wrapped around it. You know, all day we go around having to behave effectively with things that might shift a little bit. Thinking about driving in traffic, any 2 days is driving in traffic exactly the same as it was the day before.
Never.
Absolutely never. I mean, you could maybe arrange it that way if you wanted to coordinate with a bunch of people, but even then you have to account for differences in like
The weather.
The weather, what time you start, how dark it is, the temperature, all of those things are going to be a little bit different. And so we are able to sort of adapt to these situations. And sometimes it takes a little bit larger adaptation. Sometimes the circumstances are a little bit more dire, but all of it is just stuff that we do and we kind of just do all the time. And so to say that we do that and now that's consciousness, well, I haven't explained it any better. I've just layered a new thing on top of it.
Yeah.
Or not a thing, I guess, a construct on top of it. All right,
cool.
last one.
Yeah. Let's hear it.
All right, so the last argument against this idea of consciousness is this of any practical importance? Even if we give drugs that alter the state of consciousness, do we care that it was the consciousness that was altered, or are we more concerned with the effects that those drugs had on that person? Like, look, they are currently out of it. And like, if I say that it was conscious or unconscious, well, that doesn't change anything about my understanding of the fact that they're currently not responding to things.
Yeah.
You know, if we add, going back to neurology, if we're looking at what the neurons are doing, we're learning something new about how the brain works and how the brain processes information. To layer consciousness on top of it, again, that tells us nothing more about what we're observing. It's just giving this layer of confusing terms that have no correlate to any real event and just saying, oh, that's consciousness. And, you know, going back to some of those arguments for it that we're looking at. Now, I had a hard time when I was researching this, looking at the argument and being like, well, why does that mean that's conscious? Like, how are you drawing the parallels here between these two ideas? And it seems to me that it gives no added benefit to this idea at all. This is a similar idea for the drugs one. If someone is asleep, it's not the quality of consciousness we're concerned with per se. We're interested in if and how they'll respond to us or some other external stimulation or, you know, notification or event that takes place. You know, is this person going to react if someone kicks in the door and walks in here, or if someone slowly walks past them? You know, those are things that we're concerned with. And calling that conscious or unconscious doesn't tell us anything more about that situation, especially because we'll only know if they react in that particular way. We won't predict anything.
Yep.
So if we take consciousness from all the discussions, so I was talking about if we add it on top of them and all that thing, if we take it away, do we lose something?
No, outside of like, we don't have this special thing that we can kind of talk about now.
Yeah. We don't have that thing that we feel is so special.
Yeah.
This idea of consciousness. It's like, you know, we try and remove this sort of metaphysical idea of consciousness out of these experiences. That doesn't make those experiences any less valid or any less interesting to try and study. In fact, it makes it a little bit clearer, I think, in what we could try and learn about them.
Yeah.
You know, we're no longer hunting for something that doesn't exist. We're just looking at what's actually taking place. And I think that's great.
Yeah, and just to be real clear, we've been hunting for this for at least 2,500 years.
Yeah, very long time.
And we've yet to really find anything.
Yeah.
At all.
And I think that honestly, the most damning argument about consciousness is not that it's wrong or even harmful. It's that it's just completely unnecessary. We gain nothing by having it as a concept. We lose nothing by taking it away. It seems simply to exist for the sole purpose of sort of confusing the events that are actually taking place by providing no explanatory value to them whatsoever.
That is pretty damning. I'll give you that.
So this was kind of interesting to me. I've seen this happen in a few different interviews, and so I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but when asked what the greatest question science could solve might be, the very well-known Richard Dawkins proclaimed at that point that understanding consciousness to him would be the greatest thing he would like to see achieved by science in his lifetime. I remember hearing that and just thinking, what? Why? It's so unnecessary, and it seems to not even really exist. You know, at the time I had done a little bit of reading, not as much as I've done up until this point.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, like, this seems like one of the least interesting things we could possibly learn a whole lot about, because I think what we're going to have to conclude is that there is no such thing as consciousness. We have nothing to learn about it. And I mean, that's my opinion. I could be totally wrong. And if I am, then Dawkins is right. And that's great. And regardless of how you feel about him politically or religiously or otherwise, you have to admit he's a pretty smart guy.
Yeah.
So I was just surprised that like that was the thing he was so intrigued by. And even something that might have these really profound implications, the fact that it's so on the fence whether or not it's even real, to me is sort of like that seems like that shouldn't have been a target at all if it had that much question about it even existing in the first place.
Yeah, I can see where he's coming from, though. I guess like in the sense that it's supposedly alters everything, right?
That's fair.
In the degree to which you're aware of something. So we could be missing out on everything else that's being learned if you don't first understand this.
That's a great devil's advocate position to take.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Being a person, I want to like see some evidence of something and making progress, like, and not really seeing that anywhere. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to stand behind that, but I get the perspective, I guess.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay. You shut me down.
Well, no, I just like, I understand the perspective, but it's not, okay, this is a good segue. Like, where do we fall? You and I.
I love it.
So I would say that kind of go with that. Like, I get the perspective. I don't think we gain anything. I'm going to stick with that.
Yeah.
That's where I fall. Like, I don't think we get anything from labeling anything and talking about this stuff. Like, we haven't found any evidence yet.
Yeah.
I'm all right with the risk of maybe it's out there and not having found it yet. I mean, there's a lot of other people that are going to keep studying this anyways. It's not like me having that point ends all the research and whatnot, right?
Very, very true. Probably nobody's doing that research is listening to us anyway.
Absolutely nobody altered the research lines because of that statement.
Yeah.
At least at this point in my career. I would say that it's like useful for me to, in the sense of like, so there's this concept of like mid-level terms, right? Like, it kind of, I don't know if it doesn't really fall in this mid-level term of like between scientific and like these lay terms that we use all the time in our language.
They're just supposed to be sort of communicative.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
it kind of like, I do use in that sense. Like if someone talks about conscious and unconscious and subconscious and conscience, it definitely gives me an idea of where they're kind of to start to talk about. Maybe ish, kind of.
That's very fair.
Like, I guess we're getting down to awareness, but then I kind of question, like, why don't we just talk about awareness? Like, maybe,
Right.
you know, but I guess, like, that's the only practical use for me. Like, I kind of get an idea that they're not talking about a lot of other things, but then I still don't know what they're talking about,
Right.
per se. So it just seems like, yeah, we still don't gain a lot or anything.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you said. When teaching this sort of thing and talking about, okay, so we're not aware of our stomach that's digesting food. And I'm like, okay, so, you
Yeah.
know, I don't understand why that's so amazing to you. Our bodies do a lot of processes that help us stay alive. And the fact that I'm not spending 100% of my time going through and labeling each and one of them because I know I can tell you exactly what it feels like the whole time. Like,
That's actually pretty cool that we don't have to do that. And
Right.
We can spend our time doing things like podcasting.
right.
Yeah.
So I can orient my attention. If I had to devote such a proportion of my attention to just keeping my body doing all of these processes constantly,
Yeah.
that would be really difficult. Like I would have a hard time getting anything else done. You know, I would have to increase my ability to orient to multiple things simultaneously by
Yeah.
an enormous degree. And we haven't talked about this at all, but people are terrible at multitasking. No matter how good they think they are, most people, almost everyone is terrible at multitasking, really multitasking.
Yeah.
People can kind of coordinate some things where they're doing a few things at once, but mostly people suck at it.
Yeah.
But anyway, so, you know, if I had to devote my time and attention to focused on keeping my body running and also trying to find food and stay alive, that alone would take up all of my time and then some. You know, that'd be worth losing sleep over. I mean, there's some things that'd be nice to sort of like, and I'm going to go to sleep now, you know, and just pass out completely. And I'm going to wake up now. And, you know, it'd be nice if I had a little bit more control over those. But the fact that we don't, I think, again, this just makes very clear evolutionary sense how difficult it would be to survive and be successful in the world where you have people whose bodies are in an automatic sort of mechanical process that they just go through these steps that they need to go through in order to survive every day versus those who have to voluntarily, like, consciously control every part of what they do. I don't know. I never thought that that was particularly compelling. And honestly, It was a little frustrating to try and teach that and be like, look how cool and amazing it is that our bodies do things. Okay. Our bodies do things. Great.
Yeah.
I think that at best, consciousness is unnecessary.
Okay.
And at worst, it is really distracting away from better research that could be done.
I would say, yes, it very much could be, with the fact that we haven't found much of anything at all.
Yeah.
Read or listened to as like we haven't found it yet.
Yeah. Well, okay. I was gonna say at best consciousness could lead to really good things, but that's not what it is doing. At best, right now it's nothing. You know, it's unimportant. It's unnecessary. It's very possible that it could be a really important line of research down the road, and we just don't know yet.
Yeah.
It's been a very long time under the microscope, producing very little results.
I would hope so, given the amount of money that is put into it and time.
Right.
Given all the other world's problems. But yeah, I'm skeptical at best.
Most of the things that have been under investigation for as long as consciousness have continued to produce things.
A lot of useful things.
Yeah, we've advanced, we've learned, we've created all these new technologies.
Any technology or travel sector.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So those are things that continue to be researched. But things that have as long a history as consciousness with as little products as consciousness, most of those, it seems like they've gone away.
It makes me wonder if like Aristotle showed up, if he'd just be like, oh my God, you guys made no progress.
It's like, oh dear.
Or like little progress.
Right.
Huh. I don't know. Yeah. I'm digging a little hard right now into that. I should step back.
Okay, so I'm going to play this quote that I found from Neil deGrasse Tyson on YouTube. It's just him sort of talking about consciousness. I really liked what he had to say, and I found myself agreeing with him, basically. So anyway, here it is.
Okay. But you can say something about the question which you really would wish to know the answer to. And, I mean, for me, it would be what's consciousness? Because that's totally baffling.
Richard, you know what I think?
I agree.
Not that you asked, but what I think on this is consciousness has kind of baffled us for a while, okay? And evidence that we haven't a clue about what consciousness is drawn from the fact of how many books are published on the topic, right? We're not really continuing to publish books, not really, on like Newtonian physics. It's done, all right? So the fact that people keep publishing books on consciousness is the evidence we don't know anything about it, because if we knew all about it, you wouldn't have to keep publishing. So what I wonder, Richard, is whether there really is no such thing as consciousness at all, and that there's some other understanding of the functioning of the human brain that renders that question obsolete.
Boom.
Okay, so I generally agree with it.
Okay.
Yet, like his reference to Newtonian physics, like we also saw that like a more field theory approach, like we kind of talked about on like everything influences this stuff, kind of replaced that. So it's not like it was like learned in a fact, as he kind of implied. It was kind of like something better came along, which we kind of implied this with today of like there's a lot of things going on, right, all the time with our behavior and what's being influenced.
Right. So
yeah, the fact that there's no evidence of it, like, yeah, I agree with him, but I don't know if he kind of wraps it up succinctly enough for me.
That's fair. And I think, it's accurate to say or to criticize that in terms of saying just because there's a lot of books published about it doesn't mean that it's not real. It does imply that, as he said, there's a lot that we don't really know yet.
And I also don't think that it necessarily means that we have more to learn about the brain, because he implied that at the end, right? Like he said, like we have more to learn in the brain.
Well, yeah, I think what he was arguing there is that what we are calling consciousness could be better explained by other concepts that we already have or will learn about the things. So where people refer to consciousness as a biological process, I think the argument he was making is if we learn more about the biological process, we don't need to call it consciousness anymore. Yeah. And so, those are concepts that we have or that we could develop that are events, not constructs, because they relate to things that are really happening. Okay. That was how I understood him anyway.
Okay. Cool.
There's another thing in here I just wanted to say is it was just kind of funny because in 1991, Daniel Dennett published this very, very long book titled Consciousness Explained. And then in 2001, he wrote an article called Are We Explaining Consciousness Yet? And so quoting Schlinger, he said, if he had to ask the question, the answer seems obvious. If after, he wrote Consciousness Explained and 10 years later, are we explaining it? I think that implies that, again, this idea that Neil deGrasse Tyson was alluding to seems like we don't really know a lot about this topic at all.
Yeah. No, we definitely don't.
All right, before we get to our updated content, here's one more ad break. In listening to this episode and revisiting this, I hope that was interesting for you. But as I said, some things have happened since then. Now, that being the case, we played this clip from Neil deGrasse Tyson in the episode. And one of the points we made in the original episode, and in most episodes, is that a critical part of applying a scientific and philosophical lens to anything is that we have to describe and define our topic in such a way that we can agree on what the topic is that we are studying.
Some researchers at the Center for Consciousness Science, which appears to be housed at the University of Michigan, couldn't find the date this was founded, but earliest publications listed their website around the start of 2020, making us think that it was founded sometime in 2020 or possibly 2019. But anyway, that's beside the point. Researchers there have attempted to define consciousness more specifically, which is better than most people have done so far.
So as I was saying, like we talked about, we played this clip from Neil deGrasse Tyson about how like we just keep talking about this thing. We keep talking about consciousness. But I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But in these people that they're defining consciousness, and one of the problems we had was this lack of definition. Well, they decided they were going to apply one. They decided that they were going to try and find consciousness in the brain as a brain process by mapping regions according to their function and look for brain patterns across people who are in different states, either someone who is awake or someone who is aware and experiencing things, such as qualia, if you will, or 3, using all of the sensory inputs to engage with the stimuli and sort of natural world stimulation around them.
It's interesting stuff. So what they did was they looked at the brains of people who were anesthetized, similar to the brain of a coma patient, people who were awake, and people with schizophrenia. From 400 brain regions, they identified 3 primarily cortical regions that seemed to be associated with arousability, their word, awareness, and sensory organization, the dimensions often associated with consciousness.
So yeah, if they define consciousness as these processes and they define it as a brain process in the regions associated with those processes, then they will have basically said this is where consciousness exists in the brain and what it is. Now, what does this mean? So you might be listening to that and think, great, that sounds like they've solved it. Like they basically found where consciousness is in the brain. Okay, conceding that point for the time being, because I would actually argue with that. But for the time being, we'll set that aside. What does that mean, their discovery, what does that mean with respect to understanding consciousness? It's kind of difficult to tell, right? If anything, if we're to extrapolate anything from the fact that they've isolated it to these brain regions and defined it in such a way, it seems to suggest that brain activity is the thing people are calling consciousness.
Right.
And although many of you might hear that and think, well, of course, that's what consciousness is. That is part of the debate, is to say like, well, if it's just brain activity, why don't we just call it brain activity? Or we call it this particular network, like the consciousness network of the brain or something. But point being, they define it as this brain activity, as the thing that people call consciousness. It's just those regions of the brain. And this might be useful in terms of setting parameters of where this kind of activity takes place in the brain, if we're going to define it that way.
Right. So for instance, this mapping of cortical regions as consciousness implies that anything with a brain has activity in those regions and is conscious. Animals would likely have consciousness. Not all humans would have consciousness, and AI and plants and other non-brain possessing creatures could not have consciousness. So by this definition, it kind of eliminates certain organisms that could or could not have consciousness.
Yeah, and so just to make sure that you heard all that very clearly is if we were to look at a human brain, and we don't know that this is the case, but if we were to look at a human brain of someone who seems to be behaving normally that did not have the process in those, and again, that's totally hypothetical, may not exist, then we would essentially have to argue they are not conscious if their brain does not look like that model, right? That's a consideration. And then things that do things that look like consciousness, we'd have to say they're not conscious because they don't have a brain. Is this helpful? I mean, it depends. It depends on what you mean by helpful. What does that mean? In terms of clearing up the ambiguity of the term consciousness, sure, that could be helpful if everyone agrees that's what it is. In terms of understanding behavior, particularly among non-brained animals that nevertheless demonstrate agency and learning, such as jellyfish, flatworms, slime molds, then no, this is not particularly helpful to define it this way.
So that's just one part of this. Another new theory posits, quote, that consciousness developed as a memory system that is used by our unconscious brain to help us flexibly and creatively imagine the future and plan accordingly, end quote. And, quote, it suggests we don't perceive the world, make decisions, or perform actions directly. Instead, we do all these things unconsciously, and then about half a second later, consciously remember doing them, end quote. And that's from Budson, Kensinger, and Richmond, 2022.
Yeah. So fairly recent. And as I said, we were trying to sort of pull in the more recent research. So they go on to explain that our behavior is too fast and reactive, and we often do it without even thinking or like deliberately choosing an action. They also give the example of our racing thoughts that we can't seem to control. They're outside of our conscious control, are all reasons why their definition is better, is because it's sort of saying that consciousness is not the things that we're actively doing because we realize we've done them as we're doing them or after we do them.
Right. And so thus, according to them, if we're understanding this correctly, consciousness is thinking about our actions as or immediately after they take place and makes sense of our own behavior. And they further add that many, many mental health disorders are diseases of consciousness.
Yes, many.
Wow.
Including Alzheimer's, including autism. They list like a whole bunch that they're like, these are just diseases of consciousness.
That sounds QAnon.
Well, I'm also like, what does that mean? Like, is the treatment for these then to address their consciousness? Like, what do you mean that like it's a disease of consciousness?
The way that reads to me is like, okay, so they're not really like accounting for what a reflex does, like in like a really meaningful way. They're kind of like blowing that off, be like, reflexes, whatever. But they're also just like kind of trying to repackage awareness, right? Like, so I am recognizing, I am observing my own behavior in this moment, right? So like, it's kind of like, they're just like kind of going, that's not what that is.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's consciousness doesn't capture what that is.
I can't tell because like the way they describe it, where like on the one hand, consciousness is everything. And the other hand, consciousness is like an afterthought to everything.
Right.
I'm not sure totally how to square that. You know, it's sort of like consciousness is not really a thing. It's just sort of the fact that we become aware of our own behavior as it happens or immediately after it happens. And we just sort of remember, and then we maybe will then use that to make plans about what we'll do next time or something like that. That may have an effect. And alternatively, every problem we have is both consciousness driven and consciousness solved. And like, so that seems, I don't know how else to read their sort of statement about this, but that sort of seems like that's kind of where they're coming from. Anyway, in the previous episode, we talked about how a lack of consensus of a definition of consciousness, or even a single definition that just doesn't allude to these vague, intangible, ill-defined measures, might by itself be an indication that consciousness isn't really a thing, and that instead, if it does exist, it's better explained by some other process that we don't call consciousness, that we call whatever that process is. We refer to it that way.
Right. So these couple of examples that were not cherry picked, they were pulled from the examples of the updated research. They do not help the case for consciousness because it continues to show a lack of reference to anything measurable, except for brain mapping, which seems to exclude several phenomenon that look like consciousness, but also that is explained through, you're talking about brain activity, you're talking about neurology, you're talking about these things that are still like better explained as like I feel like consciousness is that next level of trying to like over explain something. It's like, it's kind of like the idea of God's will, right? God works in mysterious ways, or the universe is chaos. And this was a moment that was just like bad timing, I feel like there's simpler explanations for things.
Yeah. I mean, Alanis Morissette said, isn't it ironic?
Don't you think?
And there's a conversation to be had that I think would be really interesting about consciousness or learning/memory and behavior in things such as plants. Plants learn, but they don't have a brain. They react to things even though they don't have a brain.
Right.
And there are these processes by which this takes place. Jellyfish famously don't have brains. Slime molds don't have brains. Flatworms don't have brains. And so there's a conversation to be had about what learning, memory, behavior, and consciousness all have to do with what they do in a what I think a very interesting and often surprising way.
Right. And there's also a conversation about artificial intelligence and consciousness or sentience or whatever other process that might look like human behavior. We have to account for it within that space. And we have this on the list as a future dive, like kind of talking about those things. But I think it is important to understand that like these models of what we understand or what we think we understand of consciousness are occurring in places where there's not even biology, let alone not no brain, right? Like, I mean, like there's literally not a living organism, and you've got ChatGPT that's threatening the universe. I'm just kidding. ChatGPT hasn't gotten that far yet, as far as I know.
No, we're still having fun with ChatGPT.
Yes.
So I think suffice it to say for now that we continue to find ourselves in the position that this idea of consciousness, it just doesn't seem to offer anything useful, practically, clinically, philosophically. Whether consciousness is a thing or not seems to mean relatively little. except for these thought experiments about applicability to other organisms or maybe pontification about existential inquiries. So like, what does it mean to be human, for example, for whatever that's worth? And there's a lot of these. It's what's it like to be a bat? What is the experience of flavor? I'm like, the thing is, like, in my mind, that question doesn't mean anything. It's not like you're not asking anything actually substantial. What's it like to be in anything doesn't have any meaning because it's not like anything. It's just, you know what I mean?
Right.
And so it sounds like it's asking this profound question, but it's not. It's not asking anything. And so, like, if we stop to think, like, what do you mean? What does it mean to be human?
Right.
Then that it starts to fall apart again. Like, you then have to define that part of it. And so it's like, if we need to ask questions and find a way to define our terms in such a way that we can agree on what the premise is. What's our foundation? What's our starting place? Like, stop asking vague existential questions and ask meaningful ones that we can answer.
Right. And that's not to say that we shouldn't spend any time researching this or studying it or trying to understand it. I think those are fair and reasonable questions to ask in the research realm. But I think we need to start with a definition that's going to allow us to ask those meaningful questions. And we haven't really gotten there.
Right.
Because we can't do the research without and lead to meaningful outcomes if we don't even know what the phenomena is that we're studying. Now, this happens in other places. And the difference is that, like, they might understand how something works. They just know that it does work. Right? Like, you see that in some places, like, kind of that's what's going on with Google, right? Like, the people at Google don't understand how their Google search works. Like, it's kind of gotten to a point where they don't really understand it anymore the way they used to, but it works. But they can still define what it is to start.
Yeah.
And I think that's a core missing element here that we've got to get to.
That makes me think of, like, there were often some of the engineering that was done thousands of years ago to build buildings where they sort of discovered certain laws and properties of how to build things so that they would be structurally sound. And they didn't understand necessarily the physics or engineering behind why it worked, but they did know that when they did it that way, it did work.
Right.
In that case, you have a tangible outcome, right? You have a thing that stays standing and works and people can use it, or you don't. When it comes to consciousness, there's just no analog. If we were to purge that idea from our vocabulary forever and never talk about it again, we would never know it was missing.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't add anything to our conversation ever.
Right.
That is my hypothesis. Obviously, that's not based on it. That's my suggestion, because we've spent so much time arguing about not even arguing, there has been arguing, but just not defining it. So let me put it this way. If we want to define consciousness as brain activity, fine. But that, just take into consideration, that does exclude anything without a brain as being able to be conscious, even when it demonstrates learning and memory and other behaviors. And maybe that's okay. It might exclude things of it as being conscious and they don't show that brain activity, and maybe that just doesn't exist for them.
Right.
If we want to define it as something else other than brain activity, that's fine. But I think what we need to do is avoid the what is it like or the experience of being type definitions, because they don't lead us any further toward any kind of fruitful outcome.
Right.
And so, like, we're not anti-consciousness. I'm just saying, like, the scientific merit of this thing seems woefully lacking right now.
Right.
And until we're going to try and use terms that allow us to have it mean anything, I think we're just going to keep chasing our tails. And every year or two, there's going to be a new center that pops up that looks at brain mapping, or a new center that pops up that looks at whatever, and nobody's landing on consciousness. I think were I to define it, I wouldn't use the word consciousness.
Right.
Because I think what I would do is rely on existing terms that are processes that we understand that exist, that have to do with things like learning and memory and behavior and an initiation of, like, action and that sort of thing.
Right.
That those are all things that we have a better understanding of and we can study. And it seems like whenever we talk about consciousness, those are the things we're talking about anyway.
Right.
So those seem like useful places to go. But very few people are probably going to agree with me. There's probably going to be a lot of disagreement with that. But that's, I'm trying to bring this sort of skeptical, critical lens to this concept that has been given just this incredible free pass among many scientists and skeptics in the world. They're just like, the great mystery of consciousness. I'm like, what is that thing? And they're like, ooh.
I think you hit it on the head, right? Like, it might be fun to study, it might be interesting to study, but there are better ways to explain it. And on the surface, what we understand of it and know of it is not useful.
Yeah.
Like, it's not useful in any practical way. Like, it does not help with, it doesn't improve therapy. It doesn't improve treatment. Because, like, if you have somebody who wakes up from a coma, you're not going, they're conscious. Their consciousness is awoken. You're going, they're awake. They're responding to stimuli in the environment. They're doing all these things. Like, let's go look and see X, Y, and Z, right? Like, you're not measuring their level of consciousness. Not in any sort of meaningful way.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think people would colloquially use that term to say they're conscious, to say that they're awake. And again, if we want to define consciousness as awake, fine. I have no problem with that. We can just call it being awake and have another synonym for awake. Sure. That seems as fruitful an avenue to go as any other.
Right.
That works for me. But anyway, anything else that we can say about consciousness before we wrap this up?
No, I think that covers it.
All right. If you would like to agree or disagree with us, you should reach out to us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com or any of the social media platforms, not Twitter. Let's do some recommendations.
Let's do it.
Recommendations.
I am recommending a TV series. This was recommended to me a few years back, and I never watched it, and now I finally have. And it is on Netflix. It's called Love, Death, and Robots. I loved this. If you're a fan of Black Mirror, I think this is right up your alley. These are all these vignettes and different animation styles, different stories. A lot of them are sort of sci-fi themed. Many are sort of horror themed. Some of them are just kind of fun and goofy. There's some that are stop motion. There's drawn animation. There's this sort of comic book animation. There's a live action one. Most of them are the sort of 3D animation that you'd find in like, a lot of them kind of look almost like video game cutscenes in their graphics in different ways. But they all explore these topics. I will say pretty much every episode has some amount of violence and swearing, and there's often some amount of nudity or sex depicted. So if that's something you have a problem with, then this probably isn't your bag. But if you are into the very thought-provoking short form vignette style storytelling, I could not recommend it highly enough. I wish there were more episodes because I loved it. Love, Death, and Robots.
I'm so excited to check this out. The way you're describing it before was like, yeah, I need to add this to my list.
Cool.
All right. So I am late to the game on this thing since there are now 4 movies out. I don't know why I never saw it. It's just one of those things that maybe just never came up in my time.
Sure.
I just did it in my spare time. But that is a movie called John Wick. I, first of all, love and adore Keanu Reeves.
Sure. Who doesn't?
Yeah, and hopefully that does age well. Like, hopefully that's never like, that doesn't become a problem later. But right now, at this time, the day that I'm recording this, he is a gem and he is wonderful and I love him. So, John Wick, you're probably familiar with it, but if you don't know, he is a retired assassin that comes out of retirement because some people kill his dog. And obviously the story is more complicated than that. But what I really liked about the series so far, so I've watched 1, I started watching 2, and I really love this world they build where it's kind of like there are rules of engagement, there are specific guidelines for how to kill somebody, when you kill somebody, what that looks like. But I also really appreciate that everybody is just deathly afraid of him. Like, everybody is like, oh, like they're like, oh, you stole a dog? Okay, whatever. Oh, you stole his dog. Okay, well, you are clearly dead now.
Yeah.
And like, they start off like both movies the same way. They're like, he's a man of focus. He is sheer will. And you're like, okay, all right, this is good. So one thing I really like is the stunt work on it. I mean,
yeah, it's impressive.
Keanu Reeves really trained. He trained a lot on this. And you can see videos of him training with like the weaponry and stuff.
Yeah.
It's really, really impressive. It's worth a watch. So I'm excited to finish the series this week, hopefully.
Love that. Yeah. I very much enjoyed those movies. I've not seen the newest one, but yeah, that's great. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. We are running a little campaign that if we get up to 15 Patreon supporters, then we're going to do a little virtual hangout. You can spend time with us and we'll sort of chat and do something, I think probably a Q&A or maybe just talk. We like to talk. If you are a Patreon supporter already, then you have access to episodes where there's a lot of us just talking before and after episodes. But anyway, we're running that campaign. If we get to 15 by June, we'll do that virtual hangout. So come over and join us. And the people who have already joined us, who made that commitment because they would like to hang out with us, maybe, is Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, the Daily BA, Brad, Stephanie, Kelly, and Olivia. Thank you all so much for your support and the show, and we look forward to meeting you all in person soon.
Yay!
Or like virtually in person, I guess.
Yeah.
And also, of course, thank you to my team of people, that is Jess, Justin, and Shane, for all of your work in helping me do this recording the podcast that we do.
Yeah, so good, so fun.
And if you'd like to reach out to us, as I said, we're on all the social media platforms. We'd like to hear your thoughts on consciousness. You can tell us about movies or TV shows that you recommend, or tell us what we got wrong, what we got right. We love the sort of praise things. You can also support us by leaving a rating and review on our website. You can pick up some merch at our web store. You could do a giant sidewalk chalk art mural to why we do what we do in a busy public area and take a picture and tag us on it in social media. There's all these different ways you can support us that we appreciate. But I think that is all that I have. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I am forgetting, Shane?
Nothing on my end.
All right, perfect. Thank you all for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.